Up next, we have our executive interview. This is where we select an inspiring industry leader to spotlight. This year, we're thrilled to have Jill Canada, VP of Corporate and Enterprise Sales of Vail Medical Systems, interviewing Jyoti Gupta, President and CEO of Women's Health at X-Ray at GE Healthcare. Welcome to the stage, ladies.
Right. Well, I think the next thing that we need to invent, is mics that work with female clothing. Because I apparently got your memo about the black and pink, but did not get the memo about the right dress to wear. So here we go. We're going to make it work. So we thank you to the Encore team for being so gracious and working with me to make this happen. So I've got the absolute pleasure to introduce you all to Jyoti Gupta, who is going to be our executive interview today. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about her so that you all have the context for the questions that we're able to ask her, and just a little bit of formative experiences in her background so you can see where her perspective comes from. So she currently leads GE Healthcare's women's health and X-ray business, where she has the mammography business line, as well as X-ray and then bone mineral densitometry. It's about $1 billion business for GE Healthcare. And one of my career regrets is I left GE Healthcare 6 months before she came, even though I spent about almost 15 years of my professional career there. So it was actually MedtechWISION that brought us together rather than having the opportunity to work at the same company. So prior to GE Healthcare, she led a company called Volk Optical. And when we think about the theme today for driving health equity, she really hit on a lot of pieces there. So what they were on a mission to do at Volk was to prevent or to eradicate preventable blindness. And she did it in a few different ways. So thinking of the equity side of things, they were on a mission to make their technology accessible so that it was in a small footprint and that it was able to go to, we talked earlier about zip codes, also to different countries. So accessible physically by geography locations, and then also to be usable so that it didn't have to be a specialized physician or technician to operate their machinery. So she took over that business. By the way, she became a CEO for the first time in her 30s and has her second CEO role now. But in that mission to eradicate preventable blindness, took a lot of these screening equations. So there's in eye health screening to diagnosis to treatment, and they were really focused on expanding that screening. While she was there, she led a global expansion, again, along the lines of our health equity theme. And it was really a combination of her strategic and analytical mind. That's a unique combination that not everybody is blessed to have together. And also what you'll hear in some of her answers is what I see is her business acumen really came from a combination of two different types of experiences. So the large multinationals where she is now, but also working for the smaller early stage companies. So it's a unique career combination that she's had. And then another interesting thing that you may or may not know about her background is that she was living in Kuwait in 1990 when Saddam invaded. So overnight, she and her family became refugees. And she spent several weeks in a refugee camp before her family fled through Iraq and Jordan and Egypt and eventually made it to safety in the UK. And they spent some time there in the UK and then decided that they, as a family, wanted to experience a different environment. And so they moved to Abu Dhabi. And what she learned there, shaping her thinking and worldview, is the grand vision of what you could build. Because at the time she was there, it was a lot of desert. And what they took and built from that desert, and then in some cases to build or then also to rebuild grander, if not grand enough, I think helped show Jyoti that anything is possible. And I think she's carried that through with the rest of her career, as you'll see. The other thing I would say from the opportunity to get to know her is that she is clearly fearless. So she moved from Abu Dhabi over to the United States when she was 17 to attend college here, because that's where the opportunity resided. And as I think about it, my oldest child is 16. I can't imagine moving across the world. I'm trying to get her to stay in-state or nearby. So I can't imagine, as a mom on the other side of things, what that was like. But certainly shaped her worldview and business acumen. And then after education here, so studied chemical engineering in undergrad, and then actually took a year off and worked for one of our platinum sponsors up there, Medtronic, and had a year in industry, which was very formative, learned clinical trials, and gave her a taste of procedural medicine and changed the direction of her career after that. Another formative experience she had, and you're probably getting tired of hearing about yourself, was she, through a program that, let's see here, it was TIGER, so Technology Innovation Generating Economic Results. So number one, she met her husband, which is a great piece of that story, but also she had the opportunity to present to VCs. So when I think about this opportunity here, so how cool that she's here on Sand Hill Road in the midst of all the VCs when all she wanted to do at that time was to be a VC. So she, with the same perseverance that she's taken through everything in life, cold called every VC out there and didn't get any calls back because it was in the middle of an economic crisis and nobody was hiring. And I think on the very last one person called her back and said, you know what, if this is really what you want to do, you're going to need some operating experience first. You're not going to be able to go from here to there. So she took that advice and went to BD and ran one of the 5 businesses there, had the opportunity to be there when they took it public and just had the opportunity to learn everything. Also spent time at a startup called Unilife. So again, lots of early stage company experience and had the opportunity to raise capital. She's been on numerous boards. If I named them all, we would be here the rest of the afternoon. We wouldn't have time to ask her questions. And was named 40 under 40. So what I think about most is, first of all, my regret that I didn't get the opportunity to meet you earlier, because that would have been great. But most of all, she's a leader that I definitely want to follow and can't wait to hear some of the questions that we've had for her. So with that, let's get started on some questions.
Thank you for that introduction. You did it very, very well. I never really realized that I'd done all of that until you sort of said it right there. So thank you, and really glad to be here. It's my first MedtechVISION event, and really excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
And that's such a female characteristic too. So I've been studying her and her background and know it as well as she does right now. So, but we, as was mentioned earlier, we often undersell ourselves as women, and we'll make sure I won't let that happen because I know your background. So you have both witnessed and driven a lot of innovation in healthcare. And I'm wondering your thoughts on the future of healthcare and just looking at, what might make you optimistic about innovation in healthcare.
Sure. So when I think of the future of healthcare, to me, it's really sort of 5 years, 10 years out. It's personalized medicine. And it's interesting because 20 years ago when I was in grad school, I actually did a presentation on personalized medicine. And here we are about 20 years later, and I still think it's the future of healthcare. I think a lot of progress has been made in the biotech space, but when we think of med tech, health tech, by personalized medicine, I really mean getting the right diagnosis, the right treatment to the right patient at the right time. And so when you think of the example we saw this morning in Amina's case, where the doctors did a lot of different trial and error, and they had no idea what her issue was or what was going to work for her, in the world of personalized medicine, where you can use data to have individualized solutions for people, I think really that's a big part of the future of healthcare. The second thing I think is healthcare, it's already happening, but it's going to happen faster, is decentralization. So really moving from acute hospital settings to wherever the patient is. So patient home, so patient monitoring at home, something at a CVS or in your primary care. So really taking more of that care closer to the patient. And it's already happening, but a lot more work to do, and I think that's going to accelerate. And then the third is really care becoming more preventative and proactive versus reactive and acute. So those are sort of the 3 things when I think of the future of med tech. Companies like GE Healthcare, a lot of our time is spent in these particular areas, particularly precision medicine, personalized medicine. And so that's where I see the future going. what makes me optimistic is after watching and learning about today, in the beginning, it was certainly a little scary. I think you mentioned anger. I felt the same, but at the same time, knowing that there are challenges in healthcare today, I also see how technology has evolved. So what really makes me optimistic is the rapid pace of evolution of technology. So whether that's artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, which enables connected devices, telemedicine, augmented reality, virtual reality, right? All those technologies are still, I would say, early and nascent, but they're moving very, very quickly. And I see all of those as enablers in enabling these three things that I mentioned. And I think the other thing that I see is what makes me optimistic is I think previously med tech companies try to do things themselves. They partnered with consumer tech, health tech a little bit, but largely everyone sort of played in their own box. And then you saw consumer tech companies also take a stab at healthcare and try to do things on their own. Some successful, but largely I think you see every day, you read that one big venture with a lot of money that didn't work out. And now I think that everyone sort of tried it out on their own and played alone. What we're seeing is consumer tech and med tech finally realizing that to solve this big problem, you have to do it together, right? And so that's really, really encouraging because I think all along we knew there was synergy, but no one really wanted to participate in it. And so I think med tech bringing in the trust with clinicians, bringing in clinical expertise, bringing in the data, but then consumer tech bringing in the compute power that is needed, the analytical capabilities that are needed, and then just technologies like AI and now generative AI, right? And large foundational models that take a lot of money. I think when these two sort of come together, that's when the future of healthcare and med tech is going to accelerate at an exponential pace. And I already start to see that happening. And so that's what makes me really optimistic.
Perfect. So you touched a bit on AI and the future. So what do you think are the key barriers and risks we should be thinking about with AI, which is becoming part of our healthcare system and delivery?
Yeah, so AI, firstly, I think AI is as big as a buzzword it is, I think it's the key enabler in healthcare. And I think it can be deployed in different areas. So when I think of healthcare, first there's sort of at the place where care is delivered, there's clinical challenges and there are operational challenges. And then in companies like ours, in med tech companies, there are product development and then operational challenges, right? And I think AI can be an enabler in all of these. When you think of clinical, and I'll talk about some challenges and then we'll talk about risks and barriers. So when you think of clinical and operational in a healthcare setting, and I've spoken to many large hospital CEOs, and the biggest challenge today, particularly coming out of COVID, is really just the healthcare burden, right? The shortage of clinicians, the shortage of nurses, the shortage of technologists to run equipment. And so there's just so much administrative burden all the way from scheduling to pre-authorization to doing the procedure to coding to billing and then to follow up. And there's a lot of manual activity that happens. And depending on what literature you read, about 40 to 50% of clinician time is spent on administrative tasks, and less than 30% is actually spent on the patient. So how do you get a personalized care if you're not personal with the patient? And so I would say now, coming out of COVID, with the shortages, there's a large appetite to free up the capacity of these healthcare providers. And so AI can be a big enabler in sort of mimicking human interactions and automating many, many of the things and also connecting all these things. And so that's sort of one area where I think, and that's probably where it'll start, right? It'll start in some of these operational areas. The other is the clinical part, right? So helping in diagnosis, helping in treatment. There are obviously a lot of algorithms out there for screening. In my previous job, screening of retinal diseases, now screening of breast cancer, lung cancer, prostate, pneumothorax with x-rays, right? So, it's being a tool, I think, initially to assist physicians, and then ultimately there's a triage and rule out, or ultimately even screen, right? So screen out the ones who don't need to be treated, and just focus on the ones that do. So really going from, I would say, an activity-based to a risk-based. And I think AI can enable that. When you look at companies, inside our companies, where can AI help? I think product development is one of the biggest areas, right? I think most of our companies are probably working on some form of a connected device. And all of that requires software. And software talent is hard to get. It's very expensive. Depending on where you're based, there can be a lot of turnover, particularly in places, teams that might be in China, teams that might be in India. And I think with the advance of generative AI particularly, it has the potential to cut the time of writing code by half, right? So accelerating product development is one area. But then there are a lot more areas, and that would be sort of virtual clinical trials. I think we mentioned that. So leveraging AI for clinical, leveraging ultimately AI for regulatory submissions, perhaps, automating legal contracts, creating sales and marketing content, right? So there's, and then supply chain as well. So there's, I would say, opportunities sort of across the entire spectrum. What it requires is, I think, us and our companies to be open to that, to experiment, to try things, to fail fast, and ultimately sort of get to that outcome that we're looking for. You asked about, I think, risks and barriers. So I think if you read in the paper, there's a lot of buzz, right, on challenges with AI, and AI is going to rule the world. And I think you have to be responsible with AI. I think the things in healthcare, I think the big risk is, and if you talk to clinicians, right, the biggest thing is trust and transparency, and then reproducibility, and of course bias. So trust, because today most AI is a black box, and people want to know what's that data source. And that can be challenging because A, there's intellectual property, but B, there's also data privacy, right? Challenges. So the more we can think about how to, and I don't think the answers exist yet, but how to open up some of that black box just enough so that clinicians can trust it. I think that's one challenge. That's a barrier today, and I think a challenge that we have to overcome. The other is bias, right? So most data sets today, I would say, don't have underrepresented populations, don't have marginalized populations in them, may not have all the ages, all the races, all the genders. And so I think making sure when we are developing algorithms, either ourselves or with partners, is to really make sure you have that diverse data set. When I was in my previous job at Volk, we'd leveraged a third-party AI, and it worked really, really well in the US. And then we went to China and India and Africa, and the algorithm wouldn't work because the retinas in these populations are darker. And the way the algorithm was developed, it didn't look at anything that was darker than a certain shade of orange. And so right away, it was obvious this wasn't going to work. And so that just shows, though, again, it was developed sort of in the West, in Europe, by a team that probably looked at people, tested with people around them, and had teams that looked like them. And so I think just thinking about where you want to go with AI and having all the population is really, really important. So bias is the other. And then I think there are the typical things like cybersecurity, privacy, legal, ethical considerations. And I think to solve all of those, it would really be industry leaders, regulators, policymakers, and clinicians, right, coming together to figure out what are the guardrails that we can put in place to sort of create an ecosystem that works for everybody.
So you've touched on part of this, but thinking of everything you've said, do you think the role of AI will help or hinder our health equity mission that we're driving here?
So it has the potential to help, right? It can't. So if not done the right way, if we don't account for bias from day one, then by default it will hinder. But if we do, then I think it has big opportunity to help. Particularly, so in the case that I mentioned before, once we fixed it, and we got enough data sets in, we were able to enable screening in parts of Africa where there was no access to an ophthalmologist. we were able to enable screening in rural villages in a country like India, where you have a population of 1.5 billion people, and you only had 11,000 eye doctors. So 11,000 eye doctors for 1.5 billion people, where a large population has diabetes, and diabetes is a leading cause of blindness. So there are all these people at risk of going blind, but nobody to see them. And so once we'd addressed the algorithm, we were able to go deploy very large screening programs with government support to at least rule out the ones who are fine, right? You're good, come back next year. And then the ones who need to be seen, they can be seen. So again, taking it from sort of activity-based to risk-based. So I think it has the potential to help. I think the biggest challenges are inequity or access, cost, right? So I think just like the internet brought the world online and people now have access and are educated and have their own businesses, I think middle classes in countries outside the US have grown, including in the US have grown. I think AI has very similar opportunity to, particularly in healthcare, to provide access. And then when you think of cost, I think it has the opportunity to reduce the entire cost of healthcare because, as I mentioned, doctors today are spending their time on non-clinical activities. And so when you take away a majority of that, you're by default going to reduce the cost of healthcare as well. So in my view, I think if done the right way, it certainly can help.
Perfect. So given this audience of medtech industry leaders, what role do you believe medtech will play in fostering health equity? And then what's your advice to all of us to ensure that we're each doing our part?
Yeah, so I think medtech is a critical part of healthcare, right? So I think all of us have a role. I think some of it was touched in the panel before, but I'll just share my thoughts. So again, look at it two ways. One is, I think we learned today, health equity, it's largely determined by sort of the social determinants of health, right? And so things like income, education, nutrition, housing, all of those impact health equity. And as people and leaders in companies, we have the opportunity to hire. And so when we're hiring, right, we should consider hiring people perhaps who do have disabilities, perhaps who may not have that degree that you're looking for or come from the top school that you might be looking for, right? Just by doing that, I think you lift society, and then you start becoming part of the solution to these social determinants of health inequity. So that's one. Then the other is, what can we sort of practically do in our day jobs? Again, hiring, I think Nivi mentioned it, is when we're building our product teams, making sure we bring people who are diverse and who can relate. So that's the first thing. The second, I would say, is get out in the field. It's amazing just by spending a day at a hospital or in an OR or in a clinic, how much you learn, and all those things that we might have debated and discussed in the conference room, they just go away. When I was at Becton Dickinson, it was sort of my first job out of grad school, and I worked in strategic marketing. And my job was to bring the voice of the customer to the engineering team. And the engineers made what they thought was cool. And we worked on self-injection devices, and it was my first project was an auto-injector. And so we sort of had these four stakeholders: patients, pharma, prescribers, and payers. And so I spoke to a bunch of patients, and these were patients with rheumatoid arthritis. And so if you've met patients with RA, depending on how severe their RA is, they can't really move their hands. They don't have much dexterity. And so here was our team making these auto-injectors with really, really high forces to push a button to activate. And what I did is and I knew it wasn't going to work. They couldn't even hold it. But I had to take the engineering team out into the field. And I said, come with me and just watch these 6 or 7 patients, and let's give them the different things you've made. And I didn't have to say anything at that point, right? They could just watch and they could observe. And they're like, oh, it's too hard for them to press, right? So I think the power of, at GE, we call it going to Genba, but just go out. I think today we saw the video, right? Had the engineers gone out and seen, maybe been in a NICU or a PICU, right? They would see that what has been developed and what's being used doesn't meet the use case and the environment. So I think getting out in the field and encouraging your engineers, particularly, I think we've all been in those meetings where you're sort of having that back and forth, particularly if you're a product manager. Just take them out. solves a lot of problems. So that's a second. I think third is education and training. I've lived across the world. I run global teams. And one of the things I found is doctors, healthcare providers, no matter where they are, in the US or in the world, but particularly when they don't have training at the most prestigious institutions or don't have a fellowship or a residency, they are hungry for knowledge. They are hungry for information. And if we are making the solutions that solve health equity challenges, getting the users trained, ideally you want to make it in a way that they don't need the training, but we're in the healthcare field and they need some. So I think going out and spending time on education and training is really important as well. Just as an example, again at Volk, we worked with what was called the Himalayan Cataract Project. It's a nonprofit, and for a couple of years, we would go to Ghana and we would do surgeries, cataract surgeries, for patients who had cataracts, and some of them just couldn't see for most of their life. And we were very proud of the fact that we would go for 5 days and we would do 800 surgeries, and we had 800 people seeing, right? But as sort of a couple years went by, we said, all these patients only come here when we come here. Because we weren't training, we weren't educating, we weren't enabling the doctors over there. We were taking experts, and then we were doing our bit. Everybody waited for the whole year for us to come, and then we left, and then everybody sort of stayed back. And so investing, but then we changed that to let's educate the residents, let's educate the fellows. And in fact, just a couple months ago, one of the doctors who in 2016 when we went was an intern, was a resident, now is running the program. Now he is a trainer, right? So I don't know, 7-8 years later, he's the one who's training the next generation. And so we sort of enabled sort of this continuity. So I think that's the third, is education and training. And then the last is advocacy. I think we all, I would say, whether individually or through our companies, have the ability, I would say, to influence policy and regulation in some capacity. So I think using that voice, using the platform that we have, I think it is the other thing I'd recommend.
Perfect. So we've just got a few minutes left, so I'll ask you maybe 2 more real questions and one lightning round. So another one, just having grown up in a predominantly male-dominated industry, did you experience any challenges, like continuing feeling like you need to prove yourself, especially as a minority woman, with your story as you really ascended to quite an impressive career?
So it's an interesting question. So I come from an Indian background. My parents are from India. India is known to be a patriarchal society, so you would expect that I would have felt sort of something holding me back. Fortunately, my parents never did that, so I never felt anything young growing up. I grew up for a long time in between Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates in the Middle East, another country where I would say women are not first-class citizens. And I never really felt anything there either. And then I went to Georgia Tech. I did engineering, and highly male, school, engineering school. I would have thought I would have experienced something there, and I didn't either. And then I went into MedTech. My customers were mostly pharma. And I would say sort of throughout, at the time at least, I didn't feel like there was a difference. Now I look back and I say, wait, there were some signs. But at the time I was either, too naive, ignorant, or arrogant, or a mix of all of them. But I didn't notice anything until I got my first CEO role. So I was sort of the person, who are these women? Why are they complaining? They should just, stop complaining and get on with their life. I don't know what they're talking about. So I was very blind to the fact that there was any difference or there was any disparity. And it was very interesting because I came from environments where there should have been, and then I never encountered it. Or I was too ignorant or arrogant. But then when I got my first CEO role, and now the spotlight, I guess, was on me, right? That's when it sort of hit me in the face. And I didn't know, and until today, I don't know. I don't know if it was gender or age or race or education or all of them combined, or sort of being that company was in the Midwest. Like, I don't know what it was, but it hit me in the face, and I realized, okay, there is a difference. And then I've always hired young women, particularly young women out of school. And I realized, as I would meet and speak with some of them, they would sort of share with me stories of what they were experiencing in the very company that I was leading. the challenges they would have, perhaps with the VP of operations or VP of engineering who were male. And so being their side, I realized, okay, there is a challenge, right? And so now I was in a position that I had to sit down with my male leaders and sort of train them and talk to them about maybe the experience, the impact they may be having on other people. So I would say it's really then that I realized there is a challenge, and now I advocate for women, and I go out of my way to look for little signs, but all along I didn't.
So one more real question and then on to some fun. So could you share some advice that you received maybe early in your career that you didn't listen to? And then maybe on the converse, advice that you did listen to that made a difference?
Okay. Well, we'll start with the one I did listen to, and you mentioned a little bit about it earlier. So when I was in grad school, I did this program, Tiger, where you took a PhD student, so that was me, an MBA student from Georgia Tech, and then 2 law students from Emory, one on the prosecution side, one on the litigation side. My husband ended up being the litigation side lawyer. And we would get in a group, and we would do business plan competitions and present to angel investors and VCs, and it was a 2-year program. And so I got sort of my first introduction to VCs, and I thought I really wanted to be a VC because these people are so cool, they have all the money, and they control where it goes. And so that's when I cold emailed everybody, pre-LinkedIn, height of financial crisis. One woman wrote me back from a biotech firm in the Bay Area. She said, all right, come on over in the fall. I have an internship for you. I was a deal flow intern, and so I got to read thousands of business plans, and then I would decide who to bring in. And so I really wanted to be, a partner at a VC firm one day and start, sort of analyst, associate, work my way up. But then that partner who hired me gave me this great advice. She said, look, if you truly want to be a VC, you need to go learn how to operate a company. Because if you don't, you're never going to get the respect of the CEO that you've invested in. And you're not going to know how to advise them because you don't have operating experience, so you're not going to be able to tell them what to do or help them in any way. And so that was profound advice, and I took that to heart, and so then entered into industry. And then ultimately started operating companies and realized I actually enjoy this. I don't necessarily have to be a VC, right? So that sort of went away. Although I might at some point. I think listening to the conversations today and looking at, there's only less than 3% of investment, right, into women. I think maybe we should open up our checkbooks and do something there. So when I think of advice I didn't, so that was the best advice, by the way. The advice that I didn't take, there are probably many, and some I should have taken, and others I'm glad I didn't. But the one that I didn't take was when I was leaving from Becton Dickinson to go to Unilife, which was a startup. And Unilife was a competitor to BD. It was very, very early. A few of us were leaving at the same time. And I remember over a dozen people and dozen leaders, and I was in my 20s, came to me and said, you're making the biggest mistake of your life. And don't do this. We know the financials of this company. They've come to us for money many times. It's not going to exist. You won't have a job in less than a year. And so that was obviously scary. But I took the risk anyway, right? So that's a mistake. And I said, and I think someone also said to me, they won't be here, but we will. To which I said, exactly, you will, right? So if you will, and if it doesn't work out, you'll take me back. So I went, and it was the best decision I ever made, because for the next 6 years, for those of you who worked at startups, that's honestly where I learned. The only reason I'm here today is because I did those 6 years. Because that's where firsthand, you design, you develop, you set up clean rooms, you go sign big deals, you figure out contracts, you raise a whole bunch of money, we went public, you do it all. You serve coffee to investors, you pitch to them the next second. So that's really where I learned how to build a business and how to run a business and how to connect all the dots across the business, which then prepared me for the next role. So I'm glad I didn't take it, because that's where I grew up. Yeah.
So I love that swagger, which reminds me of another female athlete. So what did you think of Coco Gauff's recent U.S. Open win and her message? Because I think she had a strong message after that win.
She did. So I was actually at the Open on Saturday. I happened to be in New York for a customer meeting. And then she won and made it to the finals. I'm like, well, I'm going to be here on the weekend anyway. Let's get last minute tickets. My husband was with me and we went. And it was the best. And I'm not a tennis person. I only watch tennis, or any sport for that matter, when there's like finals or something like that. And firstly, watching her was just such a treat. You could see sort of in the beginning, she was nervous and Sablenka was strong. But then you could see sort of after the first set, she came back and you sort of saw the dynamics turn. So overall, I thought the match was fantastic. And then her message, thanking, in her message, she thanked her opponent, her family, her coach, her team, right? And then the people who didn't believe in her. And I think all of us at some point, I know I certainly have had people who didn't believe in us, right? And I just thought her message sort of, calling them out, but then also sort of mentioning that it actually fuels her and makes her shine bright. I thought that was really, really strong. It's interesting, though, because I talked to sort of some of my male friends, and their view was, I don't know why she did that. She'd won. Winning is good enough. It was immature. She's 19. She shouldn't have done that. And my view was, we need more of that.
Right.
So it's interesting how, just different people have different points of view. But overall, I enjoy the game, and I thought her message was really powerful, and I think we should do more of that.
She spoke her truth about, I think she said that they thought they were pouring water on her fire, and instead it was gasoline, and that was beautiful. So 19-year-old has great advice.
Exactly.
So I think it's time for virtual audience questions now, I believe is the next piece. So is that Matt to be coming up here?